People don't usually disappear far from where they start. In many documented cases, the distance between a marked trail and the point where someone goes missing is measured in minutes, not miles. The surroundings are familiar. The conditions are often ordinary. There is no clear moment when danger appears. A few steps past the blazes. On most maintained trails, the route is reinforced by small, repeated cues. Paint blazes on trees, worn tread, cut branches, and a line that keeps returning the hiker to the same narrow corridor. Search and rescue reports often begin at the moment that corridor is broken. The separation can be brief and ordinary. A person steps aside for privacy, walks around a downed tree, follows a faint side path to a viewpoint, or tries to regain footing on loose ground. In many cases, the distance off trail is measured in yards before the scene changes into dense cover, uneven slope, and muted sound. Researchers who study search patterns have described off-trail travel as a leading reason adult hikers end up requiring rescue. A 2019 National Geographic report discussing research on hiker rescues describes wandering off-trail as the most common reason adult hikers require search and rescue ahead of injury and weather. The behavior can look deliberate from the outside because the path choice is visible on maps and track logs. Inside the moment, it often begins as a small adjustment that feels safe and temporary. In Washington state, the disappearance of Samantha Sayers is often summarized in official records by its date and its location. Sayers, 28, went missing near Vesper Peak on the 1st of August 2018. The Snohomish County Sheriff's Office later announced that search operations had been suspended, while noting that personnel would continue spot checks as conditions allowed. News coverage at the time described a multi-day search that involved ground teams and aerial resources in steep terrain. When the sheriff's office suspended active searching, a local report quoted the agency as saying, "We have exhausted all leads and tips." Vesper Peak sits in a part of the North Cascades that compresses distance. A short mileage on paper can contain sharp elevation gain, slide alder, and loose talus. In that setting, a person can move from an established route into terrain where the same few steps carry a larger consequence. When agencies describe a case as missing, the record tends to fix on the last confirmed point: a trailhead, a summit register entry, a time-stamped photo, a text message, a parking location. From there, the map becomes a search grid, and the practical question is not why someone left a trail in a philosophical sense, but where the first break in travel likely occurred. The Appalachian Trail provides a very different landscape for the same kind of separation. The corridor is long, marked, and heavily walked. Even there, one step away from the tread can be enough. Geraldine, Jerry Largay, a 66-year-old hiker, went missing on the 22nd of July 2013 while hiking in Maine. Reporting after her remains were found described that she stepped off the trail to use the bathroom, became disoriented, and could not find the trail again. She survived for weeks, leaving notes that were later recovered with her campsite. The account is often cited because it shows how quickly a familiar route can vanish when the visual anchors disappear. The physical details in cases like Largay's tend to repeat across regions, even when the circumstances differ. It replaces it with surfaces that do not record direction clearly. Ground cover hides footprints, branches spring back. A person looking for a trail often walks while scanning, which shifts attention upward and away from the ground. Over short spans, that scanning becomes a pattern of angled movement, pauses, and course corrections. The resulting track can curve without the person noticing. When SAR personnel talk about lost person behavior, they often mean observable decisions rather than motives. A person may keep moving instead of staying in place. Someone may attempt to shortcut to a road or a water feature that appears on a map. A hiker may choose a line that feels like it should lead back to the main route because it is open, downhill, or follows sound. In some terrain, game trails and drainage lines offer a deceptively clean passage for a few minutes, then thin out, fork, or end in brush. From the air, that choice can look like a deliberate departure. From the ground, it can look like the only clear way forward. The problem becomes sharper in places where trails are informal or lightly maintained. In many parks and national forests, side routes exist that do not appear on official maps, or they appear as faint traces without signage. Boot paths can lead to viewpoints, fishing spots, or social media locations. These paths can feel official because they are compacted and used, but they may end abruptly. In regions where snow lingers, trail tread can be covered while nearby terrain remains open, which encourages people to walk on what looks easiest. Marker visibility changes with light and season. Fallen trees can conceal blazes. In wet conditions, a person may avoid mud by walking the edge, then continue on a parallel line until the true trail is no longer visible. In recent years, news reports about rescues continue to describe the same initiating act in plain terms. A hiker loses the trail, becomes disoriented, or follows the wrong line. A 2025 report on a New Hampshire rescue described an experienced hiker losing the trail in snowy, wet conditions with fallen trees and obscured markers, calling 911 before his phone died, and then being located by rescuers near where the call had placed him. The language is practical, focused on conditions and location. It reflects how agencies document these events, what the person intended, where the person was last confirmed, and what environmental factors complicated orientation. The quiet detail that sometimes stands out in missing person files is how normal the earlier part of the day appears. Parked vehicles are locked, food is packed, the planned route matches a common day hike, weather forecasts may be acceptable, family members describe routine check-ins. In the Sayers case, official statements reference the passage of time since the last confirmed date and the reality that active searching had reached its limit under the conditions present. In the Lage case, reporting emphasized that she was not far from the trail when her campsite was eventually found. Despite the length of time, she remained undiscovered. These records do not require an unusual trigger to produce an off-trail outcome. The initiating move can be small, and the later pattern can still look strange from outside the event. In dense forest, sound dampens quickly. In steep country, a person can be above or below a trail without seeing it. In overgrown terrain, a hiker can miss a turn by a few feet. In boulder fields, the trail can be indicated by scattered cairns that are easy to lose in fog or low light. A corridor of tread that felt stable an hour earlier can become hard to re-find when the person turns around and the view is reversed. Investigators and SAR coordinators tend to keep returning to the same anchor points because those are the pieces that can be verified. Time last seen, route planned, weather, terrain, and confirmed locations. From there, they build outward, sometimes for days, sometimes for weeks, and then they record a suspension of active operations when the search no longer yields new information. In some cases, as with Vesper Peak, the public record continues as occasional spot checks and periodic references to the missing status. In other cases, discovery occurs long after the initial effort, in terrain that was previously searched, in a place close to where the trail should have offered safety. The map stops matching the ground. Official incident reports often note a precise moment when navigation ceases to be reliable. This moment is rarely dramatic. It usually appears as a short line in a case summary. Missed junction, unclear signage, trail obscured by weather, or reliance on an outdated map. From that point forward, movement becomes harder to reconstruct. What follows is not panic or urgency, but a slow mismatch between expectation and terrain. In national parks and forests, trail systems change subtly over time. Storms alter drainage, snowmelt shifts tread, maintenance schedules vary by region and funding. Maps, whether printed or digital, represent an idealized version of the route. They show lines, intersections, and elevation, but they do not show fallen trees, braided footpaths, or seasonal reroutes. When hikers describe becoming lost, they often say the trail faded rather than ended. The ground no longer matches the map, and the correction feels temporary. A 2020 report by the National Park Service summarized search and rescue data across multiple parks and noted that navigation errors were a leading factor in incidents involving experienced hikers. The errors were not limited to backcountry travel. They occurred on day hikes, loop trails, and well-marked routes. In many cases, the person believed they were still on the correct path, even as physical cues became inconsistent. That belief delayed corrective action. One documented example occurred in Rocky Mountain National Park in October 2017, when a hiker following a mapped route encountered snow cover that obscured the trail. Park statements later explained that the individual continued along what appeared to be a natural corridor, assuming it rejoined the main path. Search teams found evidence of travel along a drainage line rather than the intended trail. The report did not describe fear or urgency. It described distance, slope, and reduced visibility. Trail junctions are a frequent site of early error. Some intersections are marked with posts or signs. Others rely on tread clarity and repeated use. In areas with social trails, multiple lines can leave the same point. A person arriving from one direction may not recognize the correct continuation when approaching from another. This is especially common when returning the same way, because the visual cues are reversed. What looked obvious on the way out may not register on the way back. Digital navigation has introduced a different kind of mismatch. GPS tracks, phone maps, and downloaded routes provide confidence, but they also flatten the experience. A hiker following a screen may pay less attention to ground features. When a device loses signal, battery power, or accuracy under canopy, the sudden absence of confirmation can be disorienting. SAR debriefs often mention that the person continued moving based on memory of the route, rather than stopping to reassess. It becomes problematic when the memory no longer aligns with the terrain. In Shenandoah National Park, rescue reports from the late 2010s frequently referenced hikers missing turns at trail junctions with similar names or parallel routes. Rangers described how short connector trails could be mistaken for main routes, leading people onto longer or steeper paths than planned. The resulting fatigue increased the likelihood of further navigation errors. The pattern did not require unusual behavior. It followed ordinary assumptions about distance and direction. Another recurring detail in case files is the use of landmarks that are less stable than expected. Rock formations, ridge lines, and streams can serve as guides, but they also branch, curve, and repeat. A hiker may follow a creek downhill, believing it leads to a known crossing or road. In mountainous terrain, streams can descend into steep, brush-filled ravines that limit movement. SAR teams often find tracks that follow water for a short distance before stopping or turning upslope, suggesting the person reassessed but did not regain the trail. The timing of these early errors matters. Many occur late in the day, when light angles change and shadows obscure tread. Others occur shortly after leaving a main route, when the person assumes the trail will reappear. In both situations, the decision to continue rather than stop is documented as common. SAR manuals describe this as normal travel behavior, not panic. The person is still operating under the assumption that the deviation is minor. Weather contributes in ways that are understated in reports. Light rain can darken soil and reduce contrast between trail and forest floor. Fog can compress depth perception. Snow can erase footprints and blazes. Wind can mask sound cues such as voices or running water. In a 2021 rescue in Mount Hood National Forest, officials noted that the hiker's map was accurate, but snow and fog obscured the junction where the trail turned. The individual continued straight, following what appeared to be a ridgeline. The report focused on visibility in terrain, not on decision-making under stress. Once the map no longer matches the ground, people tend to simplify their goals. Instead of reaching a destination, they aim to regain something familiar. That may be a trail, a road, a river, or a ridgeline. These features feel reliable because they are continuous. SAR analysis shows that this choice can lead people farther from known routes, especially when the feature bends away from the intended direction. The movement is consistent and purposeful, which can later appear intentional in hindsight. In many missing person cases, the first confirmed error is identified only after the fact. Investigators piece together GPS data, phone pings, witness statements, and physical evidence. They mark where the person should have turned and where they actually went. The gap between those points is often small. In some cases, it is less than a quarter mile. The significance of that gap grows with terrain complexity and time. The records do not suggest that people are drawn away from trails by unusual forces. They describe a process of ordinary navigation breaking down in subtle stages. A line on a map fails to appear on the ground. A junction looks different than expected. A shortcut seems reasonable. Each step is documented in the language of distance, slope, and visibility. The calm tone of these reports reflects how predictable the sequence is from a search and rescue perspective. By the time a case enters the public record as a disappearance, the early navigation error has already passed. What remains is the task of reconstruction. Agencies rely on known patterns to estimate where the person may have gone next. They search drainages, ridges, and trail continuations. When those efforts end without resolution, the file records a suspension of active searching. The initial moment, when the map stopped matching the ground, remains fixed as a quiet turning point. When familiar terrain stops guiding, in many disappearance and rescue files, the person involved had already traveled the area before. The route was not new, the landscape was not unknown. This familiarity is often mentioned early in statements to rangers or deputies, usually as reassurance. It appears in phrases such as, "had hiked it before," or was comfortable with the area. In practice, familiarity does not always reduce risk. In some cases, it alters how carefully a person monitors their position. Search and rescue analysts have long noted that repeat visitors behave differently than first-time hikers. A person who has walked a trail before may rely less on signage and more on memory. They may anticipate turns before reaching them, or expect landmarks to appear in a certain order. When the environment changes even slightly, those expectations can become unreliable. Trails erode, vegetation grows back, new social paths appear. Snow, fire damage, or seasonal flooding can alter the appearance of terrain that once felt fixed. One example frequently cited in training materials involves return trips. A hiker reaches a destination without difficulty, then becomes disoriented while retracing their steps. This occurs because visual cues look different in reverse. A junction that was obvious when approached from one direction may blend into the background when approached from the other. Elevation changes also affect perception. A gradual climb on the way out becomes a steep descent on the return, changing sightlines and balance. In Yosemite National Park, rangers have documented multiple incidents in which hikers became lost within a mile of trailheads during their return. In public summaries, officials describe missed turns on descent, particularly in areas with granite slabs, switchbacks, or braided use trails. These hikers were often within earshot of developed areas at some point, but could not identify the correct route back. The reports emphasize distance and terrain rather than confusion or distress. Loop trails introduce a similar problem. A loop offers reassurance because it suggests there is no wrong direction. In reality, loops can intersect with spur trails, service roads, and social paths that break the symmetry. A hiker may assume that any well-worn path continues the loop, even if it leads elsewhere. In Shenandoah National Park, incident logs from the late 2010s describe hikers leaving loop trails and continuing on connector routes, believing they were still on the main circuit. The error often went unnoticed until expected landmarks failed to appear. Familiarity also affects how people respond to uncertainty. A first-time visitor may stop quickly when something feels wrong. A repeat visitor may continue, expecting the trail to make sense again after the next bend. SAR debriefs often note extended movement after an initial error in cases involving locals or frequent hikers. The behavior is not reckless. It reflects confidence built from past success. Terrain that looks consistent can reinforce this confidence. Forests with uniform tree cover provide few fixed reference points. Rolling hills can obscure horizon cues. In such settings, a person may feel oriented because nothing appears dramatically different. This is especially true in boreal or temperate forests, where sightlines are short and sounds are absorbed. The absence of strong directional feedback allows small errors to persist. In Montana's national forests, missing person cases involving hunters and hikers often include statements that the individual knew the area well. Investigators later determined that familiarity did not prevent off-route travel. In some cases, it contributed to it. A hunter may follow an animal track into unfamiliar ground, assuming they can navigate back easily. A hiker may take a shortcut remembered from years earlier, unaware that logging, regrowth, or erosion has changed the landscape. The Dearborn River area, east of Helena, where 4-year-old Nylene Marshall disappeared in 1983, illustrates how familiar settings can still produce lasting uncertainty. The family was picnicking in a known recreation area. Adults present were familiar with the location. When the child went missing, searchers covered terrain that locals believed they understood. Decades later, the case remains unresolved. Despite repeated searches and public familiarity with the area, the setting itself offered no clear boundary that contained movement. Familiarity can also reduce the perceived need for navigation checks. A person who has completed a route before may not stop to confirm position at junctions. They may bypass map consultation or ignore GPS discrepancies, assuming the device is wrong rather than their memory. SAR reports occasionally note that hikers dismissed early signs of error because this didn't match what they remembered and chose to continue rather than reassess. Another factor is time compression. When someone believes they know an area, they may underestimate how long it takes to traverse it. This leads to later travel in low light. As daylight fades, terrain recognition becomes harder. Shadows obscure tread, colors flatten. In wooded areas, dusk arrives earlier under canopy. Reports frequently document people becoming disoriented within the last hour of planned travel. After a day that began confidently, weather can amplify this effect without drawing attention to itself. Light snowfall mist, or wind may not register as hazards to someone who has hiked the area in similar conditions before. The difference lies in accumulation and timing. Snow that falls after a person passes a junction can erase footprints and soften edges. Fog can remove distant reference points that were previously visible. The hiker continues, expecting familiarity to compensate. In cases where remains are eventually located, they are sometimes found in areas that searchers and locals believed were unlikely. This includes terrain close to trails, roads, or known landmarks. The distance traveled off route is often short. The difficulty lies in detection rather than access. Dense vegetation, uneven ground, and visual uniformity conceal presence. Familiarity with the area does not make these features less effective. Search coordinators account for this by expanding grids beyond expected boundaries. They do not assume that a person stayed within known routes simply because they knew them. Instead, they consider how familiarity might have influenced decisions. Did the person take a remembered shortcut? Did they continue past a missed turn because the area felt right? These questions guide resource deployment, even when answers remain uncertain. The records show that familiarity does not function as a safeguard. It changes behavior in subtle ways that can delay recognition of error. When terrain stops guiding effectively, the person may not realize it immediately. Movement continues under the assumption that recognition will return. By the time it does not, the opportunity to easily retrace steps may have passed. Small deviations that go unnoticed. In many case files, there is no single moment when a person clearly decides to leave a trail. Instead, the record suggests a gradual shift. The route bends slightly. Foot placement adjusts around an obstacle. A person chooses firmer ground at the edge of the tread, then continues on that line. These movements are ordinary and efficient. They are often repeated without conscious attention. Over time, they change direction. Trails are not fixed channels. They widen and narrow depending on use, season, and maintenance. In heavily traveled areas, the tread may spread into multiple parallel lines as people avoid mud or erosion. In lightly maintained regions, grass and leaf litter can obscure the original path, leaving several options that look equally valid. A hiker selecting the clearest surface may drift away from the intended route without realizing it. Search and rescue reports frequently describe this process using neutral terms. They note gradual deviation, parallel travel, or use path. These phrases indicate movement that is consistent and purposeful, not erratic. The person is still walking as they would on a trail, maintaining pace and direction. The difference is that the surface beneath them no longer leads where expected. One common source of unnoticed deviation is obstacle avoidance. Fallen trees, washouts, rock slides, and snowfields interrupt the trail. Most hikers respond by stepping around the obstruction and rejoining the path on the other side. In some terrain, especially dense forest or talus slopes, the rejoining point is not obvious. The person may regain a track that feels like the trail but is slightly offset. Each step reinforces the assumption that the correct route has been found. In the Pacific Northwest, SAR summaries often mention slide alder and blowdown as complicating factors. These features force hikers to weave through brush or climb over debris. While doing so, attention shifts to balance and footing. Direction becomes secondary. When the brush thins, the hiker continues forward, assuming the trail continues as well. The deviation may be only a few degrees, but over distance, it carries the person away from the original line. Footpaths created by wildlife can also influence movement. Game trails follow contours, ridgelines, and water sources. They are compacted and easy to walk, sometimes more so than maintained trails. In forested areas, these paths can run parallel to human routes for short distances before diverging. A hiker stepping onto such a path may not notice the transition. The walking experience remains similar, and the surroundings do not immediately signal a change. Drainage lines create another subtle pull. Shallow channels collect water and remain clear of undergrowth. They offer a natural corridor through dense terrain. A person moving downhill may step into a drainage to avoid brush, then follow it for several minutes. In some landscapes, the trail itself follows a drainage, which reinforces the choice. When the trail leaves the channel and climbs out, the hiker may continue along the watercourse instead. SAR teams often reconstruct these movements by examining track patterns. They look for signs of consistent stride, direction, and speed. In cases where people were later found or rescued, tracks sometimes show a smooth transition from trail to off-trail travel without hesitation marks. This suggests the deviation was not perceived as a mistake at the time. Shortcuts are another source of gradual error. A person may attempt to cut a switchback, cross a meadow, or descend directly toward a known feature. The shortcut feels efficient and familiar, especially to someone who has hiked the area before. If the terrain allows easy travel initially, the choice appears justified. When the ground steepens or thickens, the hiker may continue, believing the difficulty is temporary. In parks with heavy visitation, social trails develop quickly. These paths lead to viewpoints, water access, or informal campsites. They are worn enough to suggest regular use, but may not be maintained or marked. A hiker encountering such a path at a junction may choose it unintentionally, especially if signage is minimal or weathered. The deviation is small, but the destination is different. Time plays a role in how these deviations accumulate. Early in a hike, a small error may be corrected quickly because energy is high and daylight is abundant. Later in the day, the same error may persist because the hiker prioritizes forward progress. Fatigue reduces the likelihood of stopping to reassess. Each correction is postponed until the next obvious marker appears. In some documented cases, hikers realized they were off route but could not identify when it happened. Interviews conducted after rescues often include statements such as, "I don't remember leaving the trail," or "it just wasn't there anymore." This reflects how gradual the process can be. Without a clear decision point, memory does not mark the transition. Environmental conditions can mask these shifts. Leaf fall covers tread in autumn. New growth narrows paths in spring. Snow creates a uniform surface that hides edges and depression. In winter conditions, people often follow existing footprints, assuming they belong to the main route. If those tracks were made by someone who also deviated, the error propagates. The uniformity of some landscapes further reduces feedback. In forests with evenly spaced trees and consistent understory, direction is hard to judge without a compass or GPS. Slopes may be subtle enough that uphill and downhill are not obvious. Sound does not travel far, limiting auditory cues. In these settings, a person can walk for long periods without encountering a feature that clearly contradicts their assumption. In search records where outcomes were fatal, investigators sometimes note that the individual traveled efficiently off-trail. The path taken avoids the most difficult obstacles, suggesting ongoing problem-solving. This challenges the idea that deviation results from confusion or fear. Instead, it points to ordinary movement continuing under changed conditions. When SAR teams plan searches, they account for these small deviations by expanding their assumptions. They do not expect straight lines or sharp turns. They look for gentle curves, parallel travel, and downhill drift. They search drainages, benches, and open timber where walking would have been easiest. These choices reflect an understanding that the initial deviation was likely unnoticed. The absence of a clear boundary between trail and off-trail travel complicates both prevention and reconstruction. Education materials often emphasize staying on marked routes, but the transition is rarely obvious in the moment. A person may believe they are still complying, even as their path slowly diverges. Case files rarely assign importance to the exact step that led away from the trail. Instead, they document where the person should have been and where evidence suggests they went. The gap between those points is filled with ordinary actions, stepping around obstacles, choosing firm ground, following the easiest line. These actions do not stand out individually. Together, they alter direction. Over time, the cumulative effect becomes significant. Distance increases. Landmarks fail to appear. The opportunity to simply turn around diminishes. By the time the deviation is recognized, the return path may not be obvious. The trail that once guided movement has been replaced by a series of small, reasonable choices that no longer point back. Sound, slope, and directional drift. When orientation weakens, movement often begins to follow basic physical cues rather than planned routes. Search and rescue records repeatedly describe this transition without emphasis. The language used is practical. Reports refer to downhill travel, drainage following, and movement toward perceived openings. These are not framed as mistakes. They are described as natural responses once the trail is no longer providing guidance. Slope is one of the strongest influences. Walking downhill requires less effort than climbing, especially after hours of travel. In many landscapes, downhill movement feels like progress because it suggests an eventual exit point. Roads, rivers, and valleys are commonly located below higher ground. When a person is uncertain of their position, descending can feel like a reasonable way to simplify the terrain. SAR case files frequently show tracks trending downslope after an initial deviation, even when the planned route required continued climbing or lateral travel. This pattern is well documented in mountainous regions. In Colorado, Utah, and Washington, SAR teams note that lost hikers often descend into drainages rather than attempt to regain ridgelines. Drainages offer clearer footing, fewer obstacles, and a defined direction. They also funnel movement into narrower corridors. Once committed, reversing course becomes more difficult due to steep banks, brush, or loose rock. The descent may continue longer than intended because the terrain allows it. Sound also plays a role. Human hearing is directional, but in forests and canyons, it is easily distorted. Water, wind, and distant traffic can be perceived as closer or more consistent than they are. A hiker who hears running water may move toward it, assuming it leads to a stream shown on a map. The sound may come from a different drainage or be amplified by terrain. SAR debriefs occasionally mention that individuals reported heading toward water or following the sound of a creek. The records do not treat this as unusual behavior. Open terrain exerts a similar pull. Clearings, meadows, and talus fields offer visibility and easier walking. After time spent in dense forest, an opening can feel stabilizing. A person may angle toward open ground to regain visual reference, even if it means leaving the intended line of travel. Once in the open, the absence of markers can make it harder to choose a correct direction. Movement continues based on ease rather than navigation. Directional drift emerges from the combination of these factors. A slight downhill angle, a faint sound, or a visible opening nudges travel in a particular direction. Each adjustment is small. Over time, the cumulative effect becomes significant. SAR teams reconstruct this drift by examining terrain features rather than assuming straight-line travel. They expect curves, gradual turns, and consistent bias towards certain features. In forests with uniform canopy, drift can occur without visual awareness. The ground may slope subtly, encouraging movement in one direction. Without a compass check, a hiker may believe they are moving laterally when they are slowly descending. In post-incident interviews, rescued hikers sometimes express surprise at how far they traveled downhill without noticing. The reports describe this as terrain-driven movement, not inattention. Sound-based movement is particularly difficult to assess after the fact. Unlike slope or vegetation, sound leaves no physical trace. Investigators rely on statements, timing, and environmental context. In some cases, phone records or GPS data show a turn toward a drainage shortly after the person lost the trail. In others, the only indication is the final location relative to known water sources or roads. The assumption is not that the person was seeking rescue, but that they were following a cue that felt grounding. Weather can amplify these tendencies. Wind masks distant sounds while highlighting nearby ones. Rain increases the volume of water moving through drainages. Fog reduces visual range, making sound a more prominent guide. In such conditions, people tend to simplify decision-making. They choose the path that requires the least immediate interpretation. Downhill, audible, and open routes meet that criterion. In several well-documented cases, individuals were later found in drainages that ran roughly parallel to maintained trails. The distance between the trail and the drainage may have been small, but the terrain between them was difficult. From within the drainage, the trail was not visible or audible. Search teams later noted that the person had likely remained within the same watershed the entire time. The movement appeared logical given the conditions. Directional drift also affects search planning. SAR coordinators consider the likelihood that a person continued downhill, even if that contradicted their stated plan. They prioritize lower elevations, watercourses, and benches where travel would have been easier. This does not imply that people intentionally seek these features. It reflects observed patterns across many cases. The influence of slope is evident even in relatively flat environments. In rolling terrain, small elevation changes can still guide movement. A person may follow a gentle decline without recognizing it as such. Over distance, that decline leads away from the intended route. Without prominent landmarks, the change is hard to detect. SAR reports from eastern forests often mention gradual descent as a factor, even when total elevation change was modest. Sound cues can also mislead in developed areas adjacent to wildland. Traffic noise, machinery, or voices may suggest proximity to roads or buildings. A hiker may move toward these sounds, believing help or exit is nearby. Terrain can block direct access, forcing detours that increase distance traveled. In some cases, the sound source turns out to be farther away than expected or separated by impassable ground. Once drift is established, it tends to persist. Each step reinforces the chosen direction. Turning around requires a conscious decision to abandon the perceived logic of the movement. SAR literature notes that people often continue along a chosen line until a clear barrier appears. That barrier may be a cliff, dense brush, or exhaustion. By then, retracing steps may be impractical. In recovered cases, tracks sometimes show extended travel along a single contour or drainage, suggesting commitment rather than wandering. This challenges the idea that lost individuals move randomly. The movement is structured by the environment. Sound, slope, and openness create a path of least resistance. The person follows it because it works moment to moment. The records do not assign intent to these choices. They document outcomes. A person leaves a trail, drifts downhill, follows a drainage, and is later found at a lower elevation. The explanation remains grounded in terrain and behavior, not motivation. These patterns are consistent across regions and experience levels. Understanding directional drift helps explain why people can move far from trails without realizing it. The environment offers guidance that feels reliable when other cues have failed. That guidance does not lead back to the trail. It leads along features that favor ease and continuity. By the time SAR teams begin their work, the drift has already shaped the search area. Planners anticipate where the person is more likely to have gone, based on slope, sound, and terrain. They search where movement would have been easiest, not where the trail would have gone. The quiet influence of these factors is evident in how often missing persons are found downhill, near water, or in open corridors. The pattern does not require unusual circumstances. It emerges from ordinary responses to uncertainty in complex terrain. Fatigue, without urgency. Fatigue appears in search and rescue documentation as a gradual condition rather than a sudden event. Reports describe it in terms of slowed pace, shortened steps, longer pauses, and altered priorities. It does not usually coincide with distress calls or obvious signs of trouble. Instead, it shapes decisions quietly, influencing how long a person continues moving and how carefully they evaluate their surroundings. Physical tiredness accumulates over time, especially on uneven ground. Trails demand constant adjustment of balance, footing, and posture. Off-trail, that demand increases. Stepping over logs, pushing through brush, and navigating loose rock require more effort than walking on maintained tread. As energy declines, people conserve movement without consciously planning to do so. They favor easier surfaces, reduce elevation gain, and avoid backtracking. SAR incident summaries often note extended travel beyond planned distances. A hiker continued past the intended turnaround point, or decided to keep moving toward a perceived exit. These choices are not framed as poor judgment. They are described as responses to time, distance, and energy already expended. Turning around can feel like undoing work, while continuing forward feels efficient. Fatigue also affects how people interpret uncertainty. Early in a hike, a questionable junction or unclear trail marker may prompt a stop to consult a map. Later in the day, the same uncertainty may be resolved by choosing the most obvious path and continuing. The decision reduces immediate effort. It delays reassessment. SAR debriefs frequently mention that lost individuals reported noticing inconsistencies but choosing to see if it cleared up ahead. In several documented rescues, hikers described feeling tired but not alarmed. They did not consider themselves lost. They believed they were slightly off route or behind schedule. This distinction matters in reports. A person who does not feel urgency is less likely to stop moving or signal for help early. Movement continues under the assumption that resolution is nearby. Time perception changes with fatigue. Distances feel longer, slopes feel steeper, landmarks appear farther apart. A hiker may believe they have not traveled far since the last known point, even when evidence later shows otherwise. SAR teams account for this by expanding search areas beyond what the person estimated they could reach. The discrepancy between perceived and actual distance is a recurring theme. Fatigue reduces the likelihood of retracing steps. Going back uphill or through difficult terrain requires energy that may no longer be available. A person may look at the slope behind them and decide to continue forward instead. The choice is practical. It avoids immediate exertion. In mountainous terrain, this often leads further downhill, reinforcing earlier drift. Rest decisions also change. Tired individuals may stop in places that feel convenient rather than strategic. They sit on logs, rocks, or clear ground without assessing visibility or proximity to routes. In some cases, these stops become extended. SAR reports sometimes note that a person rested longer than expected, or stop to recover before continuing. The rest itself is not problematic. The location can be. Hydration and nutrition play a role. Dehydration and low caloric intake reduce concentration and physical capacity. Case files occasionally mention that individuals ran out of water or food earlier than planned. The effect is cumulative. Reduced intake does not immediately stop movement, but it narrows the range of choices that feel manageable. The person favors the path that appears simplest. In wooded environments, fatigue can reduce situational awareness. Attention narrows to the immediate ground. Peripheral cues are missed. Trail markers placed above eye level may go unnoticed. The hiker continues walking without actively scanning. This behavior is documented in post-rescue interviews, where individuals report focusing on just getting through a section. Fatigue without urgency is particularly evident in late afternoon incidents. The day has progressed normally. Weather may still be acceptable. The hiker expects to finish soon. When progress slows, the response is often to push a little farther rather than stop and reassess. SAR data shows that many lost person reports originate from overdue hikers rather than distress calls. The individual did not perceive a need to alert anyone earlier. In some cases, fatigue alters the willingness to leave obvious routes. A tired hiker may step off trail to avoid obstacles or crowds, believing the detour will save energy. The calculation is short-term. It reduces effort for the next few minutes. Over time, it increases complexity. SAR reconstructions sometimes show that the initial off-trail move occurred late in the hike, after hours of steady travel. Nightfall compounds these effects. As light fades, the energy required to maintain balance increases. Visual information decreases. Fatigue makes adaptation harder. People continue moving because stopping feels worse than walking. Reports from nighttime rescues often note that the individual kept traveling until they were physically unable to continue. The absence of urgency delayed the decision to stop earlier in safer terrain. Cold weather adds another layer. Maintaining body heat requires energy. Tired individuals may move to stay warm, even when stopping could allow for shelter building or signaling. SAR files from colder regions mention continued movement in low temperatures, followed by rest periods that became longer over time. The behavior reflects an attempt to manage discomfort rather than a planned strategy. Communication choices are also affected. A fatigued person may delay using a phone or emergency device, believing they can resolve the situation independently. They may conserve battery power by limiting use, which reduces opportunities for location updates. In some cases, the first call for help occurs only after the person has traveled significantly farther from the trail. Search coordinators recognize fatigue as a shaping factor rather than a trigger. They do not assume that a tired person stops immediately. They expect continued movement along easier lines. They search benches, drainages, and open timber, where walking would have required less effort. This approach reflects patterns observed across many incidents. Recovered tracks often show slowing pace and shorter stride length over distance. These signs indicate fatigue without collapse. The person is still moving deliberately. There is no evidence of panic. The movement remains purposeful, guided by ease rather than navigation. SAR teams use this information to estimate travel limits and likely rest points. In cases where individuals are found deceased, investigators sometimes note that the person covered more ground than expected, given their physical condition. Fatigue did not stop movement immediately. It altered its direction and quality. The person continued until environmental constraints or exhaustion intervened. The record remains descriptive, focusing on distance, terrain, and time. Fatigue also affects group dynamics. When hiking with others, tired individuals may defer decisions or follow without questioning direction. If the group fragments, the tired person may be less likely to correct course independently. SAR reports involving separated groups often note that the last person to be seen was moving slower or resting when contact was lost. The absence of urgency is central to how fatigue operates in these cases. The person does not feel threatened. They do not perceive a crisis. They are managing discomfort within what they believe is a controllable situation. This belief sustains movement, even as options narrow. By the time fatigue becomes severe enough to force stopping, the person may be far from the trail. The opportunity to easily regain known routes has passed. SAR teams then encounter a search area shaped by hours of steady, low-effort movement, rather than abrupt decisions. The documentation treats fatigue as a background condition. It is rarely highlighted as the cause of disappearance. Instead, it is embedded in timelines and movement patterns. Its influence is indirect but consistent, It shifts how people choose paths, when they reassess, and how long they continue. Understanding fatigue without urgency helps explain why people do not stop earlier, signal sooner, or turn back when uncertainty appears. The records show that tiredness changes behavior quietly. It does not announce itself. It guides movement toward what feels manageable in the moment, even when that movement leads farther from the trail. The delay before stopping. In many documented incidents, the point at which a person realizes they may be off route does not immediately change their behavior. Case files often distinguish between being lost and feeling lost. The first is a factual condition. The second is a subjective state that may not occur right away. Between those two moments, movement often continues. Search and rescue reports frequently include phrases such as believed they were slightly off trail or thought they would reconnect shortly. These descriptions appear across regions and experience levels. The individual notices that something is wrong, but the discrepancy does not yet seem serious enough to require stopping. The decision is framed as temporary. One more bend, one more descent, one more clearing is expected to resolve the issue. This delay is not marked by urgency. There is no sudden change in pace or direction. The person continues walking much as they were before. SAR analysts describe this as a common phase in lost person behavior. It is characterized by continued forward travel, selective attention to confirming cues, and dismissal of conflicting information. The environment still feels manageable. In interviews conducted after rescues, individuals often recall this period clearly. They describe noticing that landmarks did not appear when expected, or that the trail surface felt different. They may recall checking a map or GPS and deciding that the device was inaccurate. These recollections are presented without alarm. The person believed the situation was still within their control. One reason stopping is delayed is the perceived cost of stopping. Pausing requires admitting that progress has halted. It introduces uncertainty about what to do next. Continuing forward preserves momentum and purpose. Even when doubts arise, walking feels like an action that leads somewhere, while stopping feels like giving up information rather than gaining it. Environmental conditions can reinforce this choice. In cool or wet weather, stopping can be uncomfortable. Standing still increases cold exposure. Sitting down may soak clothing. In warm conditions, stopping may feel inefficient when shade or water seems nearby. SAR reports occasionally note that individuals continued moving to stay warm or to reach shelter, even when their direction was uncertain. Another factor is the expectation of recognition. People often assume that a correct route will announce itself. A trail sign, a wider tread, or a familiar feature is expected to appear. Until that expectation is fully contradicted, stopping feels premature. This belief is reflected in statements such as, "I thought it would open up again," or "I assumed I'd see the trail soon." The delay before stopping is also influenced by prior experience. Individuals who have successfully corrected navigation errors in the past may expect the same outcome. Their memory includes instances where continuing forward resolved confusion. This reinforces the decision to keep moving, even when the context is different. SAR documentation notes that experienced hikers may persist longer before stopping than novices. Time of day affects this phase. During daylight, visibility supports the belief that progress is possible. The environment appears navigable. As long as light remains, the urgency to stop is reduced. Many overdue hiker reports indicate that sunset passed while the individual was still moving, not because they ignored darkness, but because they expected to finish before it mattered. Communication choices during this period are telling. People may send brief messages indicating they are delayed but not concerned. Others may refrain from contacting anyone, believing the issue is minor. SAR timelines often show that hours pass between the first deviation and any attempt to call for help. The absence of communication is not framed as denial. It reflects a belief that the situation does not yet warrant it. Stopping also requires choosing a location. Off-trail, suitable stopping points may be limited. Dense vegetation, steep slopes, or uneven ground discourage rest. This can add distance traveled after the initial recognition of error. SAR teams sometimes find that individuals stopped only after reaching a bench, drainage, or clearing. The concept of waiting it out appears in many survival guidelines, but it is rarely adopted immediately. Waiting requires confidence that remaining in place is the best option. When orientation is only slightly compromised, that confidence is low. The person believes movement will restore certainty. SAR records show that waiting typically occurs later, after multiple attempts to correct course have failed. In some cases, individuals do stop briefly, but then resume movement. They may pause to look around, consult a map, or rest, then continue along a chosen line. These intermittent stops are documented through track patterns that show pauses followed by renewed travel. The stops did not resolve uncertainty, so movement resumed. The delay before stopping can also be shaped by perceived proximity to help. Sounds of traffic, voices, or machinery may suggest that roads or buildings are nearby. Even if these sounds are distant or distorted, they create a sense that exit is close. The person continues toward them rather than stopping, believing assistance is within reach. In incidents involving groups, stopping decisions may be deferred by social dynamics. Individuals may hesitate to suggest stopping if others appear confident. When groups separate, the person who lags behind may continue moving to catch up rather than stop and signal. SAR reports involving group separations often note that the last person seen continued in the same direction as the group, even when unsure. The delay phase is often invisible in public summaries. News reports tend to focus on the moment a person is reported missing, not on the hours of ordinary movement that preceded it. In official case files, however, this period is reconstructed through timestamps, GPS data, and witness accounts. It often represents the longest span between deviation and rescue or discovery. When stopping finally occurs, it is usually forced by external factors rather than a planned decision. Darkness, impassable terrain, injury, or exhaustion may leave no option but to pause. At that point, the individual's location may be far from the trail, shaped by earlier drift and fatigue. The effectiveness of stopping early is well documented in survival literature, but the records show that early stopping is rare. The delay is not due to ignorance of advice. Many individuals are aware of recommendations to stay put when lost. The difficulty lies in recognizing the appropriate moment to apply that advice. The transition from slightly off to lost enough to stop is subjective and gradual. Search planners account for this delay by assuming continued movement after initial error. They do not focus only on the last known point. They project travel paths forward, considering terrain and behavior. The delay phase explains why people are often found farther from trails than expected, even when they recognized a problem earlier. In cases where individuals are found alive, interviews often include regret about not stopping sooner. This reflection appears after the outcome is known. At the time, the decision to continue felt reasonable. The environment did not present a clear signal to stop. The delay was not a single choice, but a series of small continuations. The documentation treats this phase as predictable. It does not assign blame or speculate about intent. It records that people tend to keep moving until movement is no longer possible or useful. This pattern holds across age groups, fitness levels, and environments. The delay before stopping shapes the entire incident. It determines distance traveled, terrain encountered, and the complexity of the search. Once stopping occurs, the situation changes from navigation to survival. SAR teams then shift from tracking movement to locating a stationary subject. Understanding this delay helps explain why missing person cases often involve extended travel without clear turning points. The person did not abruptly decide to abandon the trail. They continued doing what had worked before, longer than the environment allowed. By the time the decision to stop is made, it is often late in the sequence. The earlier opportunity to stop closer to the trail has passed quietly, without notice. The record preserves this as a series of timestamps and locations, not as a dramatic moment, choosing a place to wait. When movement finally stops, the decision is rarely framed as a formal choice. In case files, it appears as a change in behavior rather than a stated plan. Tracks end, GPS points cluster. Phone activity slows or ceases. Investigators later infer that the person decided or was forced to remain in one area. The reasons are usually practical. The ground became difficult, light failed, energy was depleted, continuing no longer felt useful. The location where a person stops is often shaped by convenience rather than strategy. Search and rescue reports describe individuals stopping on benches, in shallow drainages, beside logs, or at the edge of clearings. These places offer flat ground, reduced brush, or some sense of enclosure. They are chosen because they allow sitting or lying down without immediate discomfort. Visibility, signaling potential, or proximity to the trail are not always factors at that moment. Many people stop near terrain features that have guided their movement up to that point. Those who drifted downhill often stop in lower elevations, Those who followed drainages may stop beside water. Those who moved toward open ground may stop at the edge of a meadow or talus field. The choice reflects continuity rather than reassessment. SAR documentation shows that stopping points are frequently close to natural barriers. Steep slopes, thick vegetation, cliffs, or dense deadfall limit further movement. When forward travel becomes more difficult than resting, the person pauses. In mountainous terrain, this may occur at the base of a slope or where a drainage narrows. In forested areas, it may occur where undergrowth thickens abruptly. Visibility at the stopping location varies. Some individuals choose open areas with long sightlines. Others stop in enclosed spaces that provide wind protection or a sense of shelter. The choice often depends on immediate conditions. Cold or wind encourages enclosed spots. Heat encourages shade. Rain pushes people under tree cover or rock overhangs. SAR files rarely interpret these choices as deliberate survival strategies. They are recorded as responses to conditions. The concept of waiting is not always present initially. People may intend to rest briefly before continuing. Track patterns sometimes show short stops followed by resumed movement, then another stop. Over time, these pauses lengthen. Eventually, movement does not resume. Investigators identify this point retrospectively, based on the absence of further travel evidence. In some cases, individuals stop close to the trail without realizing it. Dense vegetation, terrain folds, or sound absorption can conceal nearby routes. SAR teams have documented finds within short distances of maintained trails where visibility was limited. The person stopped because travel ahead was difficult, not because they believed they were far from help. The proximity is discovered only after the fact. Stopping near water is common, but carries mixed implications. Water provides hydration and a familiar reference. It also attracts insects, increases humidity, and lowers nighttime temperatures. SAR reports note both benefits and complications. Individuals may stop beside streams believing they will be easier to locate or follow later. In practice, drainages can be hard to search thoroughly, especially when vegetation is dense. The presence of shelter influences stopping decisions. Rock outcrops, fallen trees, and thick canopy offer protection from precipitation and wind. People gravitate toward these features when tired or cold. In some recovered cases, individuals constructed minimal shelters using available materials. In others, they simply position themselves against natural barriers. The effort expended reflects remaining energy rather than planning horizon. Once stopped, behavior changes measurably. Phone usage may drop to conserve battery. Movement becomes localized. The person may adjust position slightly for comfort or warmth, but does not resume directional travel. SAR teams identify these areas by clustered sign, disturbed ground, or repeated GPS points. The transition from travel to waiting is marked by concentration rather than spread. Communication attempts sometimes occur after stopping. Text messages, calls, or emergency signals may be sent once the person accepts that movement is no longer resolving the situation. In some cases, communication occurs earlier but stops later due to battery depletion or signal loss. SAR timelines often show that the last contact coincides closely with the establishment of a waiting location. The choice of where to wait affects detectability. Open areas offer better visibility from the air but less protection. Enclosed areas provide shelter but limit line of sight. SAR analysis does not assume that people optimize for detection. The record shows that comfort and protection often outweigh signaling considerations at the moment of stopping. Weather continues to influence behavior after stopping. Cold encourages stillness to conserve energy. Rain discourages movement and signaling. Heat may prompt relocation within a small area to find shade. SAR teams sometimes find evidence of minor relocations around a central point, suggesting the person adjusted to conditions without attempting to leave. Nightfall solidifies the waiting phase. Darkness reduces the perceived benefit of movement. Many individuals remain stationary through the night, even if they had planned to continue earlier. SAR reports frequently note that movement ceased around sunset, based on track evidence and phone data. Psychological factors are documented indirectly. People who stop often organize their immediate surroundings. They may arrange belongings, choose a specific resting spot, or position themselves against a landmark. These actions suggest an attempt to create stability. The reports describe these details without interpretation, noting placement of packs, clothing, or equipment. In cases where individuals are found alive, interviews reveal that waiting felt temporary at first. The person expected to resume movement after rest, light, or weather improved. As time passed, the waiting became indefinite. This shift is not always conscious. It emerges as conditions fail to change. Search planners consider stopping behavior when allocating resources. They look for terrain features that would naturally halt movement. Benches, drainages, cliff bases, and dense vegetation are prioritized. The assumption is that once a person stops, they are unlikely to relocate far unless forced by conditions. In fatal cases, stopping locations sometimes show evidence of prolonged presence. Disturbed ground, repeated shelter adjustments, or multiple rest positions indicate that the person remained in the area for an extended period. The distance from the trail may be small or large. The significance lies in the transition from movement to stasis. The records do not frame stopping as surrender. They frame it as the end of effective travel. The person reached a point where further movement did not promise improvement. Waiting became the default state. Whether that waiting led to rescue depended on many factors outside the individual's control. Choosing a place to wait is therefore less about strategy and more about circumstance. The location reflects the path taken, the energy remaining, and the conditions present at that moment. It is shaped by earlier deviations, drift, fatigue, and delay. By the time waiting begins, the range of options has narrowed. The public often imagines lost individuals choosing highly visible or symbolic locations. Case files suggest otherwise. People stop where they are when movement ends. The place may feel unremarkable. Its importance emerges only later, when it becomes the focal point of a search, close enough to miss. Search and rescue case files contain numerous examples in which individuals were located within areas that had already been searched. The distance involved is often small. Sometimes it is measured in yards, sometimes in a few hundred meters. The reports do not treat these outcomes as failures of effort. They document how terrain, visibility, and human perception limit detection even when proximity is close. Vegetation is the most common factor. Dense understory, fallen timber, and uneven ground break sightlines. From a trail or search line, a person may be invisible a short distance away. SAR teams note that even bright clothing becomes difficult to see once it is partially obscured by foliage. Colors blend, shapes fragment. Movement, which normally draws attention, may be absent if the person is resting or unable to move. Topography compounds this effect. Small rises, depressions, and folds in the land can hide a person from view. In forested terrain, a shallow dip may be enough to conceal someone lying down. From above, tree canopy obscures ground detail. From below, slope and vegetation block upward visibility. Searchers moving through such terrain rely on sound, contrast, and chance alignment of sightlines. Sound is unreliable. A stationary person may not hear searchers if wind, water, or distance interferes. Likewise, searchers may not hear a person who is weak, conserving energy, or reluctant to call out. SAR reports frequently note that no sound contact was made, even when searchers later determined they passed nearby. The absence of sound is recorded without speculation. Lighting conditions further reduce detection. Under canopy, light levels are lower and contrast is reduced. Shadows persist throughout the day. At certain angles, glare can obscure ground features. In late afternoon, long shadows conceal depressions and objects. SAR documentation often mentions limited visibility, even in clear weather, referring to light filtered through vegetation rather than fog or rain. The human eye is tuned to detect movement and contrast. A stationary person who blends with the environment may not register as an anomaly. This is especially true if the person is wearing earth-toned clothing or is partially covered by debris. In some recovered cases, individuals were found in positions that appeared natural within the landscape, such as lying beside logs or rocks. These positions did not draw attention during initial searches. Search patterns are systematic but constrained. Teams follow grids, trails, and likely travel routes. They cannot search every square meter with equal intensity. SAR planners prioritize areas based on probability of movement and survivability. If a person stops in a low probability location, detection may be delayed. The reports describe this as a function of resource allocation rather than oversight. Aerial searches face similar limitations. Helicopters and drones provide broader coverage but reduce detail. Tree canopy obscures the ground. Shadows and terrain texture complicate interpretation. Even thermal imaging has limits, particularly in warm conditions or when a person is sheltered. SAR after-action reports sometimes note that aerial assets passed over the eventual find location without detecting it. Ground searches depend on line spacing, terrain, and speed. Wider spacing, increases coverage but reduces detection probability. Narrow spacing improves detection but requires more time and personnel. SAR coordinators adjust spacing based on terrain difficulty and urgency. In dense forest, even close spacing may not guarantee visibility. Reports document missed detections despite adherence to protocols. The behavior of the lost individual also affects detectability. A person who is conserving energy may remain still and quiet. They may not respond immediately to distant voices or may not hear them at all. Some individuals choose enclosed or sheltered positions that limit exposure. These choices improve comfort but reduce visibility. SAR files describe these positions without judgment. In some cases, individuals were alive when searchers passed nearby but did not make contact. Later interviews reveal that they heard voices faintly but could not determine direction or believed they were farther away than they were. The distortion of sound in forests and canyons contributes to this confusion. SAR documentation includes these accounts as factual observations. Time introduces additional concealment. Leaves fall, snow accumulates, weather alters the landscape. A person who was initially visible may become harder to detect as conditions change. SAR reports note that subsequent searches face different visibility than earlier ones, even within the same area. The environment does not remain static. Psychological factors influence signaling. Some individuals hesitate to call out repeatedly, fearing it will waste energy or believing searchers will see them eventually. Others may call once and then stop. SAR records sometimes include notes that no audible response was heard, despite later evidence that the person was capable of calling earlier. The reports do not assign motive. The concept of close enough appears in many after-action analyses. It reflects the reality that proximity does not guarantee detection. A searcher may walk within visual range of a person without recognizing them. The difference between seeing and not seeing can be a few feet of vegetation or a slight change in angle. In fatal cases, this proximity is particularly stark. Remains are sometimes located near trails, camps, or search routes long after operations have ended. Investigators note that the area had been searched previously, sometimes multiple times. The explanation lies in concealment, not absence of effort. The records emphasize how difficult it is to locate a stationary subject in complex terrain. Search technology continues to improve, but limitations remain. Infrared sensors are affected by ambient temperature. Jeep's accuracy varies under canopy. Drones require line of sight. SAR teams integrate these tools while acknowledging their constraints. Reports document both successful detections and missed opportunities without drawing conclusions about cause. Training materials use these cases to emphasize humility. Even thorough searches can miss people who are close. The environment controls visibility more than effort alone. This understanding shapes future planning but does not eliminate uncertainty. The phrase "close enough to miss" captures a recurring outcome without implying error. It acknowledges that detection is probabilistic. The person may be present, stationary, and alive, yet remain unseen. The distance between searcher and subject can be small enough to feel counterintuitive when the case is later reviewed. This reality influences how cases are recorded when searches are suspended. Agencies note that absence of detection does not confirm absence of presence. Files remain open. Periodic checks may continue. The landscape retains the possibility of concealment. When searches go quiet, the transition from active searching to reduced operations is recorded in official language that is careful and procedural. Agencies rarely describe a search as ended. They describe it as suspended, scaled back, or shifted to limited activity. This distinction appears repeatedly in sheriff's office statements, park service updates, and after-action summaries. It reflects an understanding that absence of discovery does not equal resolution. Search suspension usually follows a predictable sequence. Initial efforts concentrate on last known points, likely travel routes, and areas of high probability. As time passes, coverage expands outward. Resources are reassessed daily. When new leads stop emerging and environmental conditions deteriorate, commanders make a formal decision to reduce operations. The decision is documented with dates, personnel counts, and justification based on safety and feasibility. In public statements, agencies often emphasize that suspension does not mean abandonment. Phrases such as "the case remains open" or "we will continue to follow up on credible leads" appear consistently. This language is not symbolic. It reflects how missing person cases are handled administratively. Files remain active, tips are logged, Reports are updated when new information appears. The disappearance of Samantha Sayers near Vesper Peak in August 2018 provides a clear example of this phase. After more than 3 weeks of searching steep and hazardous terrain, the Snohomish County Sheriff's Office announced the suspension of active search efforts. Officials cited the lack of new leads and the increasing risk to searchers. They stated that the case would remain open and that periodic checks would continue as conditions allowed. That status has not changed in official records. When searches go quiet, the physical environment continues to change. Snow accumulates, vegetation grows, animal activity alters surface sign. Any tracks or disturbances left by the missing person degrade quickly. SAR documentation notes that detection probability decreases over time. Even if the person remains in the same location, the landscape reabsorbs evidence. Reduced search activity shifts responsibility from field teams to record keeping. Case files consolidate timelines, maps, and witness statements. These materials are preserved for future reference. Investigators note where searches occurred, what methods were used, and which areas were inaccessible. This information guides any later reactivation of efforts. Public attention often fades at this stage. News coverage declines once active searching stops. The absence of updates can create the impression that nothing is happening. In reality, the case enters a different mode. Tips are still received. Reports are still evaluated. The difference is that activity is no longer visible on the ground. Families experience this transition differently than agencies. While official language emphasizes procedure, families often focus on the uncertainty that remains. SAR reports sometimes include notes about ongoing communication with relatives, explaining what suspension means and what it does not. From an operational standpoint, quiet periods are common. Many missing person cases spend most of their existence in this state. The active search phase is often short relative to the length of time a case remains unresolved. In some instances, remains are located long after searches have quieted. These discoveries often occur accidentally rather than through renewed search efforts. Hikers, hunters, or maintenance crews encounter evidence during unrelated activity. The subsequent reports note that the area had been searched previously. The discovery does not invalidate earlier efforts. It highlights the limitations discussed in prior chapters. When remains are found years later, agencies update the case file and issue a statement. The language is restrained. It confirms identification, location, and circumstances, if known. Often, the cause of death remains undetermined. The gap between disappearance and discovery is recorded as elapsed time, not explained. There are also cases where no discovery occurs. The file remains open indefinitely. Periodic reviews may be conducted, especially if new information surfaces. Advances in technology, such as improved DNA analysis or mapping tools, occasionally prompt re-examination. These reviews are documented internally. They rarely result in renewed field searches, unless specific leads justify them. The quiet phase also involves jurisdictional maintenance. Responsibility for the case remains with the original agency unless formally transferred. Records are stored according to policy. Contact information is kept current. If tips come in from other regions or agencies, they are routed back to the case owner. This administrative continuity allows cases to persist over decades. In national parks and forests, land management agencies coordinate with local law enforcement during this phase. They may conduct limited patrols or checks in high-use areas. These activities are not searches in the formal sense. They are part of routine operations that may incidentally encounter evidence. SAR documentation distinguishes between active search missions and routine presence. The absence of visible activity can create misconceptions. Some assume that a quiet case implies resolution or lack of concern. Official records contradict this. They show that unresolved cases remain part of ongoing responsibility, even when resources are directed elsewhere. The system is designed to hold space for uncertainty. Search suspension decisions are also shaped by safety considerations. Many environments that produce disappearances are hazardous to searchers. Steep slopes, unstable rock, avalanche risk, and severe weather limit how long intensive operations can continue. SAR reports consistently note that rescuer safety is a primary factor in scaling back. This is recorded as a practical constraint, not a moral judgment. Over time, the narrative of a case simplifies in public memory. Names, dates, and locations remain. Details fade. Official files retain the complexity, but summaries become shorter. This compression does not reflect reduced importance. It reflects how unresolved information is handled in long-term records. Quiet does not mean inactive. It means that action has shifted from the field to the archive. The environment is no longer being searched intensively, but the case remains available for reactivation. This state can last indefinitely. For search and rescue professionals, the quiet phase is expected. Training materials address it directly, emphasizing documentation, review, and communication. The goal is to preserve accuracy over time. When cases are reopened, the integrity of early records becomes critical. The transition to quiet also changes how outcomes are understood. Without resolution, there is no definitive explanation. Files record what is known and leave the rest blank. This absence is not filled with theory or speculation. It is left as an open condition. In some cases, families or advocacy groups continue independent efforts after official searches quiet down. These efforts may generate new tips or maintain public awareness. Agencies document any information received through these channels. The relationship between official and unofficial activity varies by case. The quiet phase underscores the cumulative nature of the process described in earlier chapters. Small deviations, drift, fatigue, delayed stopping, and concealment all shape where a person may be when searches begin. Once active searching ends, those factors continue to define the unresolved space of the case. Records from this phase often include a final operational note, such as search suspended pending new information. This line appears in many files. It marks a procedural pause rather than an ending. The case remains part of the system. The environment itself becomes the long-term custodian. Trails are maintained, forests grow, snow melts and returns. The place where the person last moved becomes indistinguishable from surrounding terrain. Without discovery, the record remains the primary evidence of what occurred, the record that does not close. In official systems, an unresolved disappearance does not fade. It settles into a stable form. Names, dates, and locations are entered into databases that are designed to persist. The format rarely changes after the first months. A case number is assigned. A last known point is recorded. Status is marked as missing. From that point forward, the record exists without an endpoint. Law enforcement and Park Service databases treat open cases as active regardless of time elapsed. The term open does not imply ongoing field activity. It means that no verified resolution has been recorded, no recovery, no confirmed explanation. The file remains available for reference, comparison, and update. Years may pass without modification, but the status does not change unless new facts emerge. These records are not narrative documents. They are structured entries. They include biographical information, last known movements, clothing descriptions, equipment carried, and search actions taken. Updates are appended, not rewritten. The original timeline remains intact, even if later information adds context. This structure preserves the conditions as they were known at the time. In national parks and forest lands, unresolved cases are often shared across jurisdictions. A disappearance on federal land may be logged by a county sheriff, a park service, and a national missing persons registry. When one database is queried, the same basic facts appear. The consistency reinforces the permanence of the record. Time does not reduce administrative clarity. A case from decades ago can be accessed as easily as one from last year. The formatting is the same. The language remains procedural. Phrases such as last seen, last contact, and search suspended persist unchanged. The passage of time is recorded only in dates. Periodic reviews occur without public notice. Agencies may revisit old files when new technology becomes available or when patterns across cases are examined. These reviews rarely alter the original record. They add notes. A new search area may be considered. A previous assumption may be re-evaluated. Unless physical evidence is located, the case remains unresolved. The persistence of records allows for comparison. Search and rescue analysts study older cases to refine understanding of movement patterns and detection limits. These studies rely on the stability of the data. The fact that a case never closed becomes part of its informational value. It represents a boundary where known factors failed to produce resolution. Families interact with these records differently. For relatives, the file may represent the last official acknowledgement of uncertainty. Agencies document family contact and updates, but the core record remains unchanged. The absence of closure is not corrected or softened. It is preserved as factual status. In some instances, remains are discovered years later through unrelated activity. When identification is confirmed, the record is updated. Status changes from missing to recovered. The original disappearance date remains. The intervening years are not erased. The update does not explain the time gap. It marks only that the condition has changed. Many records never receive such updates. They remain static across decades. The location where the person was last known continues to anchor the file. Even as landscapes change, the coordinates remain. Trail names may be updated. Administrative boundaries may shift. The original reference points are retained for consistency. The existence of these records influences future response. When new disappearances occur in the same area, agencies consult prior cases. They look for overlap in terrain, conditions, and behavior. An unresolved record becomes part of the background against which new incidents are assessed. It informs planning without providing answers. Public access to these records varies. Some databases are open, others require formal requests. The information released is typically limited to factual details. Agencies avoid speculation. The language remains neutral. This restraint ensures that the record does not evolve into narrative over time. Unresolved cases are also used in training. SAR personnel study them to understand limitations. The absence of outcome is instructive. It demonstrates where search methods, visibility, and probability modeling reach their limits. These lessons are internal. They are not framed as failures. The record's permanence contrasts with the temporary nature of search operations. Field activity may last days or weeks. The file remains indefinitely. This imbalance is intentional. It ensures that unresolved cases are not lost to administrative turnover or institutional memory. In regions with multiple unresolved cases, lists accumulate. Each entry appears similar: a name, an age, a date, a location. The repetition emphasizes that the system does not prioritize by narrative significance. All unresolved cases occupy the same status. The language of these records is notably restrained. Terms like presumed are used sparingly. Cause of death is often listed as undetermined when remains are found. When no remains are found, cause is not entered at all. The record avoids filling gaps with inference. The persistence of unresolved files also reflects legal considerations. Declaring death without evidence requires a separate legal process. That process does not alter the investigative record. The case remains unresolved from an enforcement perspective, even if a death certificate is issued for civil purposes. Over time, public memory may simplify or distort these cases. Online discussions, media summaries, and secondary sources may add interpretation. The official record does not incorporate these additions. It remains a fixed reference point against which other narratives can be measured. In some cases, advances in technology prompt renewed attention. Improved mapping, forensic techniques, or data analysis tools may allow agencies to revisit old information. These efforts are documented quietly. They may result in new searches or reclassification. More often, they confirm the limits already recorded. The unresolved record serves as a reminder of those limits. It marks the boundary between documented action and unknown outcome. It does not suggest cause. It does not imply intent. It records only that a person entered a landscape and did not re-emerge in a verifiable way. For search professionals, this permanence reinforces caution in interpretation. They recognize that many factors influence outcomes beyond individual decisions. Terrain, weather, visibility, and timing intersect in ways that cannot always be reconstructed. The open record acknowledges that complexity, the administrative clarity of unresolved cases, contrasts with the ambiguity of the event itself. The system can say precisely when searches stopped, how many personnel were involved, and which areas were covered. It cannot say where the person went after the last confirmed point. That gap remains. The record does not close because there is nothing to close it with. Closure requires evidence. Until that evidence appears, the file remains in its original state. This is not an oversight. It is a deliberate design choice that prioritizes accuracy over completeness. In aggregate, these records form a quiet archive. They do not tell stories. They preserve facts. Each unresolved case adds another entry to a list that continues to grow slowly over time. The archive does not resolve the question of why people leave trails. It documents what happens when they do not return, the question that remains logged. Once a case reaches its final administrative state, the documentation changes very little. The record exists, it is accessible, and it is periodically referenced, but it does not evolve. What persists instead is attention, not continuous attention, and not always official, but a low, steady return of interest that surfaces without prompting. The question remains, because the record does not answer it. Unresolved cases tend to reappear in public awareness through repetition rather than development. A name is mentioned again, a date is reposted, a location is revisited. These moments are not driven by new evidence. They are driven by the stability of the record itself. The absence of conclusion makes the entry reusable. Agencies do not frame this persistence as mystery. Internally, it is treated as an expected outcome of incomplete information. A case without resolution remains available for reference, comparison, and verification. It is logged, not questioned. The record answers procedural needs, not human curiosity. That gap is where attention accumulates. Public interest often centers on the final known details. Last seen locations, times, and conditions are revisited because they are fixed. They can be mapped, photographed, and described without interpretation. Trails, trailheads, and parking areas become points of focus. These places remain accessible. People can stand where the record ends. That physical continuity reinforces attention. The question that remains is rarely framed precisely. It does not ask for motive or intent in official terms. It asks what happened after the last confirmed point. The record does not attempt to answer this because it cannot. It simply notes that the information does not exist. That absence becomes the most durable feature of the case. Over time, unresolved cases are grouped together. Lists are compiled. Patterns are suggested. These groupings are external to the original records. The official files do not imply connection. They remain independent entries. Each case is logged separately, even when geography or circumstance appears similar. The system resists aggregation without evidence. This separation preserves accuracy, but allows ambiguity to persist in public interpretation. When multiple cases exist in the same region, attention tends to accumulate around the place rather than the individuals. Forests, parks, and trail systems acquire reputations based on unresolved records. The administrative view does not assign character to locations. The public view often does. The persistence of questions is also shaped by asymmetry. Searches are time-limited, records are not. The intensity of response is brief. The duration of uncertainty is indefinite. This imbalance creates the impression that something remains unfinished. In procedural terms, the case is simply open. In experiential terms, it feels suspended. For families, the record functions differently. It is both confirmation and limitation. It confirms that the disappearance is acknowledged. It limits what can be known. Agencies document contact, but they do not modify facts to provide comfort. The record remains factual and incomplete. That incompleteness does not diminish with time. From an operational perspective, unresolved cases are not unusual. Search professionals expect a certain percentage of cases to remain without resolution. Terrain, concealment, and timing make this outcome statistically inevitable. The system is designed to accommodate that reality. The record is the accommodation. The language used in these files reinforces restraint. There is no narrative arc. There is no summary that reframes the event. The last entry may simply state that active searching has been suspended. Everything after that is implied rather than written. The absence of further text becomes part of the record. Technological change does not always alter this condition. Improved tools may increase detection rates, but they do not retroactively solve older cases without new input. When advancements are applied, they are documented. When they fail to produce results, the record remains unchanged. The question persists alongside progress. Public discussion often fills this gap with interpretation. Online forums, documentaries, and commentary revisit unresolved cases repeatedly. These interpretations exist outside the official system. They do not modify the record. They orbit it. The persistence of the question is sustained by this separation between documentation and interpretation. What remains logged is not a theory or an explanation. It is a status: missing, open, unresolved. These terms do not evolve. They do not suggest direction. They indicate that the system has reached the limit of verifiable information. Everything beyond that point is unrecorded. The final state of a case is therefore not silence, but stability. The record holds steady. It can be accessed at any time. It can be cited. It can be compared. It does not respond. The question remains not because it is ignored, but because it cannot be answered within the structure of the system. In this way, unresolved cases continue to exist as reference points rather than stories. They mark the boundary between what can be documented and what cannot. Trails continue to be walked. Landscapes continue to change. The record remains the same. The question that remains logged is not framed as a mystery within official systems. It is framed as an absence of data. That absence does not diminish. It simply persists, attached to a name, a date, and a place. If you found this video interesting, consider subscribing for more videos like this. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you on the next one.